I never believed in the stories until I saw the tracks with my own eyes. You hear all kinds of rumors out here, especially working the border. Folks talk about lights in the sky, strange figures in the desert, and animals found torn apart in ways that don't make sense. I always dismissed it as nonsense. I mean, we've got enough real threats to worry about without chasing ghost stories. That's what I thought, until that night. Now I can't unsee what I saw, and I'm telling you, it doesn't belong in this world. The desert out here isn't just empty land, it's hostile, unforgiving. You've got jagged rocks, dry riverbeds, and sand that seems to swallow the light even during the day. At night, it's a whole other animal. The stars light up the sky like you wouldn't believe, but on the ground, it's pitch black, no sound, except the occasional rustle of something you hope is just the wind. It feels alive, almost like it's watching you. When you've been on enough night patrols, you start noticing things, like how the coyotes stop howling all at once, or how the air sometimes gets heavy, like it's pressing down on you. I used to think it was my imagination. Now I'm not so sure. For weeks we'd been hearing about unusual activity along one stretch of the border. It wasn't the usual crossings or cartel traffic. Ranchers were finding cattle mutilated, clean incisions, no blood. Families reported strange lights hovering above the hills. My partner, Ortiz, joked that maybe it was the chupacabra, but I could tell it unsettled him too. Officially, we chalked it up to cartel drones and wild animals, but unofficially, nobody wanted to talk about it. That night started like any other. It was late, close to midnight, when the call came in. Movement had been detected near a remote sector about 20 miles from the nearest checkpoint. It wasn't a high traffic area, mostly rugged terrain and canyons. We figured it was probably a group trying to cross under the radar. Smugglers sometimes take people through the roughest routes to avoid detection, even if it means risking their lives. Ortiz and I loaded up and headed out, expecting another routine patrol. The drive out there was quiet, just the hum of the truck engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. I remember the moon was full that night, casting long shadows over the desert. We parked a few miles from the coordinates and started on foot, scanning the area with our thermal scopes. At first, we didn't see anything unusual, just the same barren landscape I'd seen 100 times before. Then Ortiz stopped dead in his tracks. "Do you see that?" he whispered. At first I didn't, but when I looked closer, I saw it too. Tracks. They were too big to be human, at least not barefoot. The impressions were deep, like whatever made them was heavy, and the toes, if you could call them that, ended in sharp points. Claws. My first thought was a mountain lion, but the stride was all wrong. It looked like whatever it was had been walking upright. We followed the tracks, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air felt different now, thicker, almost metallic. I could taste it in my mouth, like blood. Ortiz kept glancing over his shoulder and I could feel it too, that sense that we weren't alone. We found more tracks leading down into a shallow canyon. They were fresh, and we weren't far behind. As we descended into the canyon, the temperature seemed to drop. The walls closed in around us, and the moonlight barely reached the floor. That's when we heard it. A low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't a sound you hear with your ears exactly. You felt it, deep in your chest. Ortiz froze, his flashlight beam jerking wildly as he scanned the canyon walls. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, gripping my rifle a little tighter. The hum grew louder, and for a moment I thought the ground was shaking. Then we saw them. At first it was just a glint of light, like something reflective catching the moon, but as our eyes adjusted, we realized there were figures on the canyon walls. They were tall, much taller than any man, with long limbs and skin that seemed to shimmer, almost like scales. Their eyes caught the light, glowing faintly in the dark. They didn't move, at least not at first. They just watched us. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at them. It felt like time had stopped. Then one of them moved, a quick, fluid motion that made my stomach drop. It disappeared into the shadows, and the others followed, vanishing so fast it was like they were never there. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was almost deafening. Ortiz grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now!" We didn't need to argue. We turned and ran, climbing out of the canyon as fast as we could. I don't remember much about the trip back to the truck, just the sound of my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. By the time we reached the vehicle, the metallic taste was gone, but the feeling of being watched wasn't. We drove back in silence, neither of us daring to say what we'd seen. Back at the station, we filed our report. Just another routine patrol with no sign of activity. We didn't mention the tracks or the figures in the canyon. Who would believe us? Hell, I didn't even believe it myself, not really. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't get their eyes out of my head. Reflective, unblinking, like they were staring right into my soul. The next morning, Ortiz called in sick. He never came back to work. I tried to reach out, but he wouldn't answer my calls. A few weeks later, I heard he'd moved back to his hometown, somewhere deep in Mexico. I couldn't blame him. Part of me wanted to do the same, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not after what I'd seen. There were too many questions, too many things that didn't make sense. The tracks, the metallic air, the hum, and those eyes. I started looking into local legends, trying to find anything that could explain what we encountered. That's when I heard about the stories, the visitors. The morning after the canyon, I told myself it had to be my imagination. Lack of sleep, stress, something. But the memory of those eyes wouldn't leave me. Every time I closed my own, I saw them staring back, cold and unblinking. I started to question if Ortiz and I had experienced the same thing. Maybe he'd just been better at letting it go, running away from whatever we saw. For me, the questions wouldn't stop. What were they? Why were they there? And why? Did I feel like they had been watching us long before we noticed them? A few days later, I returned to the station. The routine didn't feel routine anymore. Every shift, I scanned the desert more carefully, watching the shadows stretch across the sands as if they hid something alive. My fellow agents started noticing the change in me. Rodriguez, a newer recruit, asked me if I was feeling okay. I told him I was fine, but he gave me this look like he didn't believe me. That night, I heard him telling another agent that the desert messes with people sometimes, makes them see things that aren't there. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that whatever we'd seen was as real as the sun burning overhead. But I didn't. I didn't need anyone else thinking I was losing it. 2 weeks passed without any reports of unusual activity, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then came the call. It was late, close to midnight, just like before. A group of ranchers near the border had spotted lights moving in the distance. Not headlights, not drones, something else. Dispatch asked for volunteers to check it out. My hand was in the air before I even realized it. Rodriguez and 2 other agents joined me. I could tell Rodriguez wasn't thrilled about being paired with me, but he didn't say anything. The drive out to the ranch was uneventful at first. The moon was just a sliver, leaving the desert darker than I'd ever seen it. The headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating rocks and cacti that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The farther we went, the quieter it got. No wind, no insects, not even the distant howls of coyotes. I thought about how Ortiz had described that silence before. It's not just quiet, he'd said. It's wrong. When we arrived, the ranchers were waiting for us near a cluster of sheds. They looked scared. One of them, an older man with a lined face and a rifle slung over his shoulder, told us they'd seen the lights again. Bright and shifting, almost like fireflies, but bigger and more erratic. He said they'd been appearing every few nights, always near the same stretch of rocky hills just beyond their property line. One of the younger ranchers chimed in, saying their cattle had been acting strange too, refusing to graze in certain areas and huddling together like they were scared of something. We split up into two groups. Rodriguez and I took one truck, while the other two agents stayed behind to talk with the ranchers. We drove toward the hills, our spotlight scanning the uneven terrain. The hum started before we saw anything. Low and steady, it felt more like a vibration in my chest than a sound. Rodriguez noticed it too. He shifted uneasily in his seat, his hand resting on his sidearm. I asked if he was okay, and he nodded, but his eyes told a different story. Then the light appeared. It wasn't like the beams from our spotlights or the glow of a campfire. It was cold and pale, shifting as if it was alive. It hovered just above the ground, moving in a slow, deliberate path through the hills. Rodriguez cursed under his breath and stopped the truck. We got out, leaving the engine running. The air had that same metallic tang I remembered from the canyon, sharp and unnatural. I felt my skin prickle as we approached the light. It flickered and dimmed, almost like it was trying to decide whether to stay visible. Rodriguez whispered something I didn't catch, and then it disappeared. We stood there in the silence, the hum still pressing against our ears. Then we saw the tracks. They were identical to the ones Ortiz and I had followed into the canyon, deep impressions with claw-like toes. This time, there were more of them, crisscrossing the area like something had been pacing back and forth. I knelt to get a closer look and saw that some of the tracks overlapped, as if whatever made them had been there more than once. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Rodriguez muttered something about it being a prank. Maybe the ranchers trying to mess with us, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. I didn't say anything. I just kept following the tracks, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hum grew louder as we moved farther from the truck, and I started to feel lightheaded, like the air was thinner here. The tracks led us to a shallow depression in the ground, surrounded by jagged rocks. In the center was a strange iridescent residue, faintly glowing under the flashlight's beam. I reached out to touch it, but Rodriguez grabbed my arm. "Don't," he said, his voice tight. I stood up and looked around. That's when I saw the figure. It was perched on a boulder just beyond the circle of light, its body blending almost perfectly with the shadows, but its eyes gave it away, reflective and unblinking, just like before. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Rodriguez didn't see it at first, but when he followed my gaze, he let out a strangled gasp. The figure moved. It wasn't fast, but the way it shifted was unnatural, as if it didn't have to obey the same rules of motion we did. Another figure appeared on the opposite side of the depression, then another and another. They didn't come closer. They just watched, their glowing eyes fixed on us. I heard Rodriguez whispering a prayer under his breath, his hand trembling on his weapon. I wanted to tell him to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The hum reached a deafening pitch, and the figures vanished, melting into the darkness like smoke. Rodriguez grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the truck. We stumbled over rocks and uneven ground, the hum fading with each step. When we finally reached the vehicle, we jumped in and slammed the doors shut. Rodriguez floored it, kicking up dust as we sped away. Neither of us said a word until we were miles from the ranch. Back at the station, we didn't file a report. Rodriguez refused to talk about it, and I didn't push him. I knew what I'd seen, but I didn't have the words to explain it. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been allowed to leave. The figures could have stopped us if they wanted to, I was sure of it, but they didn't. It was like they wanted us to see them, to know they were there. I started digging through old incident reports, looking for anything that might explain what we encountered. What I found made my blood run cold. Other agents had seen the same tracks, heard the same hum. Some even described the same glowing eyes, but the reports always ended the same way, with the details buried under vague language and red tape. It was as if someone didn't want us to know the truth. I couldn't stop thinking about the residue we found in the hills. That faint glow, the way it seemed to hum even though it made no sound. I hadn't touched it, but I kept wondering what would have happened if I had. Would it have burned, disappeared, left some kind of mark? Questions like that wouldn't leave me alone, even as I tried to bury them under the routines of work. Every time I patrolled the border, I found myself scanning for those tracks, looking for the faintest glimmer of movement in the shadows. I told myself I was being careful, just doing my job, but the truth was, I wanted to see them again. I needed to understand what was happening out there. The nightmares didn't help. They came every night now, vivid and relentless. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the metallic taste from the canyon sharp in my mouth. In the dreams, I was always running, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. Sometimes I'd hear voices, low, guttural, speaking a language I couldn't understand. Other times it was just the sound of my own footsteps, frantic and uneven, until I felt something behind me. I never saw it, but I knew it was there, close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck. Waking up didn't bring much relief. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, convinced I could still hear that hum, faint and distant, just at the edge of hearing. It wasn't just the dreams. Something about me must have changed, because people at work started treating me differently. Rodriguez avoided me altogether. When I tried to talk to him about what we'd seen, he'd shut me down with a look that said, "Don't bring it up." Other agents would cut off their conversations when I walked into the room, as if they didn't want me to hear what they were saying. Even my supervisor started assigning me to solo patrols more often, keeping me away from the others. I wasn't sure if they thought I'd lost it, or if they were just scared of catching whatever had gotten to me. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pushed out, made into some kind of outsider. I started looking for answers outside the station. Late one night, I drove out to a small cantina on the edge of a border town, the kind of place where ranchers and smugglers sometimes drank at the same bar. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I hoped I'd find someone who knew more about what was out there. An older man sitting alone at a corner table caught my eye. His face was weathered, his hands rough from years of hard labor. He looked like someone who'd seen things. I bought him a beer and asked if I could sit. He didn't answer, just waved me over. I started with small talk, asking about the cattle mutilations and strange lights the ranchers had been seeing. He listened quietly, taking slow sips of his drink. When I mentioned the tracks and the figures in the canyon, his expression changed. He set his glass down and leaned in, his voice low enough that I had to strain to hear. "They've been here a long time," he said. "Longer than us. My father used to call them Los Visitantes, the visitors. Said they only show up when the land is restless." "What does that mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. He shrugged, his eyes scanning the room as if he were checking to see if anyone was listening. "Trouble, upheaval. They come when things are out of balance, like they're watching, waiting for something. But they don't just watch. Sometimes they take." I asked him what he meant by that, but he wouldn't say more. He just shook his head and muttered something in Spanish that I didn't catch. I pressed him, asking if he'd seen them himself, but he got up and left without another word, leaving his beer unfinished. I sat there for a while, staring at the empty chair across from me, wondering if he'd just confirmed what I already suspected, or if he was feeding me a story to mess with my head. Either way, I felt the walls closing in a little more. Back at the station, I started digging through old reports, the kind that got buried in the system and forgotten. It wasn't easy. Most of the files were vague, filled with bureaucratic language that made them sound like nothing more than routine incidents, but some of them stood out. Agents reporting unexplained lights, strange tracks, and even encounters with figures that disappeared into the desert. One report from the early 2000s described an agent who claimed he'd been surrounded by what he called creatures while patrolling near a dry creek bed. The file ended with a note saying the agent had been transferred to a desk job shortly after. It felt like every time someone got too close to the truth, they were quietly pushed aside. As I read through the files, a pattern started to emerge. The sightings weren't random. They always happened in areas where there was chaos. Large groups of migrants crossing, cartel activity, or disputes over land. It was almost like these things were drawn to conflict, like moths to a flame. But why? That question gnawed at me, keeping me up at night. If they were watching us, studying us, what were they waiting for? One night, I decided to go back to the hills where Rodriguez and I had seen the light. I told myself it was just to clear my head, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed to see if they were still there. The drive out was uneventful, the desert stretching out endlessly under a cloudless sky. I parked the truck and walked the rest of the way, the hum of insects filling the night air. It felt almost peaceful, but that peace didn't last. As I approached the spot where we'd seen the residue, the air changed. The metallic tang was back, faint at first but growing stronger with each step. The hum started again, low and steady, vibrating in my chest like a distant engine. I shone my flashlight over the ground, but the residue was gone. In its place were more tracks, fresher this time, as if whatever made them had been there recently. My pulse quickened as I followed them, my flashlight beam dancing over the rocky ground. The tracks led to a narrow crevice in the hillside, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but something pulled me forward, a mix of curiosity and desperation. I had to know what was on the other side. I stepped into the crevice, the walls pressing close around me. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now, and the air felt electric, charged with something I couldn't explain. When I emerged on the other side, I froze. The ground sloped down into a wide, open space, like a natural amphitheater carved into the rock. At the center was a structure, or at least something that looked like one. It shimmered faintly in the moonlight, its surface smooth and reflective like polished metal. Figures moved around it, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows. They were taller than any human, their limbs long and fluid, almost insect-like in their movements. I couldn't tell if they were building the structure or if it had always been there, waiting for them. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until one of the figures turned toward me. Its eyes caught the moonlight, glowing faintly as it stared straight at me. My blood ran cold as the hum intensified, vibrating through my entire body. The figure moved, slowly at first, then faster, its limbs unfolding in a way that made my stomach twist. I stumbled back into the crevice, my heart racing as I scrambled through the narrow passage. Behind me, I heard the hum shift into a higher pitch, almost like a scream. When I reached the other side, I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I sped away, the hum faded into the distance, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I knew this wasn't over. Whatever they were doing out there, it was bigger than I'd imagined, and I had a sinking feeling I'd only scratched the surface. When I woke the next morning, the events from the night before felt more like a fever dream than reality, but the ache in my legs from running and the grit of sand still in my boots told me otherwise. I sat in my truck outside the station staring at the dashboard. A part of me wanted to walk in, file a report, and make someone else take the weight of this thing off my shoulders, but I knew how that would go. The looks, the questions, maybe worse. I couldn't trust anyone here, not with this. If there was one thing I'd learned from those buried reports, it was that whoever tried to expose these things ended up erased, transferred, silenced, or worse. I decided to go back to the site that night. It wasn't bravery driving me. If anything, I was terrified, but I couldn't leave it alone. I had to know what was really happening out there, even if it meant facing those things again. I packed a bag with everything I thought I might need: flashlights, extra batteries, a knife, a canteen, and my rifle. It felt ridiculous, like I was gearing up for a war I didn't understand, but it was all I could do to keep from turning around and running home. The drive out was slower this time, the night stretching out ahead of me like an endless void. The desert seemed even darker than usual, the stars faint behind a thin veil of clouds. When I parked the truck and stepped out, the silence hit me like a wall. No wind, no rustle of insects, just that oppressive stillness, as if the whole desert was holding its breath. The metallic tang returned, faint at first but growing stronger with each step toward the crevice. It clung to the back of my throat, sharp and sour, making me gag. My flashlight cut through the dark, revealing the narrow passage I'd squeezed through the night before. My fingers trembled as I adjusted the beam. I didn't want to go back in there, but I forced myself to move forward. The hum started again, low and steady, vibrating through the rock walls like a distant drumbeat. The crevice seemed narrower this time, the jagged edges pressing against my shoulders as I pushed through. When I emerged into the amphitheater, it was just as I remembered, wide, open, and impossibly quiet. But this time, the structure in the center seemed brighter, its surface reflecting. The faint glow of my flashlight like polished obsidian. The figures were back too, moving around the structure in slow, deliberate motions. Their limbs were too long, their movements too smooth. They didn't seem to notice me at first, or maybe they didn't care. But I stayed frozen, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Then something changed. The hum shifted, growing louder and higher in pitch. One of the figures stopped and turned, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. It didn't move at first, just stared, but the longer it looked, the heavier the air seemed to grow, pressing down on my chest like a weight. The others turned next, one by one, their reflective eyes fixing on me. I felt like prey under a spotlight, frozen and exposed. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure closest to me began to move, its body unfolding in a way that made my stomach twist. It stepped toward me, slow and deliberate, the hum rising with each step. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as if it couldn't handle whatever was in front of it. The creature stopped just a few feet away, towering over me. Its skin shimmered in the faint light, a texture that looked almost liquid but held firm. Its face was elongated, the eyes unblinking as they bore into mine. A low growl rumbled from its chest, vibrating through the air like a warning. My hand moved on its own, fumbling for the rifle slung over my shoulder. I didn't want to use it. I wasn't even sure it would make a difference, but the feel of the cold metal steadied me enough to take a step back. The creature tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it let out a sound that wasn't quite a roar, more like a deep, resonating pulse that made my ears ring. The others began to move, their bodies flowing over the rocks with an unnatural grace. They didn't climb, they glided, their limbs finding purchase where there shouldn't have been any. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. My flashlight flickered out completely as I stumbled through the crevice, the hum chasing me like a living thing. The air grew heavier with every step, my lungs burning as I pushed forward. When I finally burst out into the open desert, I didn't stop. My truck was in sight, a faint outline against the darkness, and I sprinted toward it like my life depended on it. The hum reached a fever pitch, the ground beneath me trembling as if the earth itself was alive. I threw myself into the truck, slamming the door shut and jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, the tires kicking up sand as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the amphitheater, the figures still moving in the distance. But there was something else now, something above them. A light, impossibly bright, descended from the sky, bathing the entire area in a cold, white glow. It wasn't a helicopter or a plane, it was silent, its edges too sharp, its movement too precise. The last thing I saw before I turned a corner and lost sight of it was the figures raising their arms toward the light, as if in reverence. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, a notification blinking on the screen. It was a voicemail, time-stamped just minutes earlier. I hadn't heard it ring, hadn't even thought about the phone since I'd left the station. With trembling hands, I hit play. At first, there was nothing but static, low and crackling. Then came the hum, faint but unmistakable, followed by a series of clicks and guttural sounds that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a language I recognized, but it felt deliberate, like it was meant to be understood on some level beyond words. The voicemail ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the screen, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. The hum was still there, faint but ever present, vibrating through the edges of my consciousness. Whatever they were, they hadn't just let me go. They had marked me, left a part of themselves behind. And the worst part, I didn't know why. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about me. It wasn't about the border or the ranchers or the cattle mutilations. It was bigger than that, bigger than anything I could comprehend. They weren't just visitors. They were something else entirely, something that didn't belong in our world, but was here anyway, watching, waiting, and now, communicating. As I sat there on the side of the highway, the truck idling in the dark, I realized I had no idea what to do next. Going back wasn't an option, but running didn't feel like one either. I was trapped, caught between two worlds, and I had a sinking feeling that whatever was happening out there in the desert was only the beginning. I didn't go back to work after that night. I called in sick the next morning, but it wasn't the flu or a fever keeping me home. It was the hum. Even after I left the desert and drove hours away, I could still feel it. Not loud, not constant, but faint, like a low vibration just at the edge of my awareness. It was enough to keep me on edge, enough to make me question whether I'd really escaped at all. Every time I thought about what I'd seen, my mind circled back to the light, that cold, precise beam descending from above. Whatever it wasn't just a random phenomenon. It was deliberate. It was connected. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still connected to me. The voicemail I'd received haunted me, not just because of the sound, but because it meant they knew where I was. I'd thought I was watching them, uncovering their secrets, but now I realized they had been watching me too. Maybe from the beginning. The hum, the residue, the tracks, it all felt like breadcrumbs, leading me somewhere I hadn't asked to go. But now that I'd followed the trail, there was no going back. I wasn't sure I wanted the answers anymore, but it felt like they were coming for me regardless. That afternoon, I went through my notes, everything I'd written down since the first sighting. The tracks, the strange lights, the locals' stories. It was all there in black and white, but none of it felt like enough. I needed something concrete, something that would make sense of all the pieces. I pulled out the old incident reports I'd copied from the station's archives. As I reread them, a pattern began to emerge, one I hadn't noticed before. The sightings weren't just random, they were clustered around certain dates, all within days of major events. Political upheavals, large-scale migrations, cartel wars. Each time the sightings spiked, like clockwork. It hit me then. The thing I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. They weren't just visitors, they were observers, maybe even participants, and they weren't here by accident. The border wasn't just a line in the sand to them, it was a fault line, a place where the fabric of humanity was stretched thin, vulnerable, and they were watching it crack. I kept digging, scouring every report, every scrap of information I could find. There was something in the language of those reports, a kind of deliberate vagueness, like the agents who wrote them had seen something but were too scared to put it into words. One report from the early 1980s caught my eye. It mentioned lights similar to the ones I'd seen, described as non-terrestrial in origin. That phrase sent a chill down my spine. The report had been flagged by someone higher up, with a note saying it was classified beyond the station level. I wondered how many other reports like it existed, buried where no one would ever find them. I couldn't stay in my apartment anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in, the hum growing louder every time I sat still. I packed a bag and left, driving aimlessly until I found myself back on the edge of the desert. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know what I was looking for, but I felt drawn there, like something was pulling me back to the place where it all started. As the sun set, the desert came alive with shadows, long and sharp against the fading light. I parked the truck and walked, the familiar metallic tang filling the air. It was faint at first, but grew stronger the farther I went. The hum returned too, low and steady, vibrating through the soles of my boots. I followed it, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as the landscape around me became eerily familiar. I knew where I was headed, the amphitheater. When I reached it, the structure was gone. The smooth, reflective surface had vanished, leaving only bare rock and sand. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all, but then I saw the tracks, fresh ones, leading into the center of the amphitheater, and something else, a faint glow, almost imperceptible, coming from a crack in the ground. I crouched down, my heart pounding, and peered into the crevice. The glow pulsed faintly, rhythmic and alive, like a heartbeat. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't. I reached into the crevice, my fingers brushing against something smooth and cold. It wasn't rock. It felt almost metallic, but it moved, shifting under my touch like it was alive. I pulled my hand back, my breath catching in my throat. The hum grew louder, and the ground beneath me trembled. A light burst from the crevice, blinding and cold, forcing me to shield my eyes. When I looked again, the light had formed a shape, hovering above the ground. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, fluid and shifting, yet precise, as if it were both solid and liquid at the same time. A voice filled the air, not spoken, but felt, vibrating through my chest and skull. It wasn't words, not exactly, but I understood it all the same. The message was clear. We are not alone. We never have been. And whatever they weren't just here to observe. They were testing us, studying us, preparing for something. The voice faded, and the light began to dissolve, pulling back into the crevice until it was gone. The hum stopped, leaving me alone in the silence. I stumbled back to my truck, my mind racing. I couldn't tell anyone about this. No one would believe me. And even if they did, it wouldn't matter. Whatever was happening out here was beyond anything humanity could control or comprehend. The border was just the beginning, a testing ground for something much larger, and now I was part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, watching me. They didn't follow. They didn't need to. They'd already made their point. The hum lingered in my ears, faint but ever present, a reminder that they were still out there, still watching. If they're out there, they've been here longer than we have, and they're not done with us yet. Hello, agents. Curious about the most famous and shocking UFO cases? My new ebook uncovers 51 encounters the government tried to hide. Find it in the pinned comment. And if you enjoyed these stories, make sure to subscribe, and there's another one waiting for you right here.